Considered Asia's premier security and defense summit, the Shangri-La Dialogue begins this weekend in Singapore at a time of extreme geopolitical instability. Asian countries have been deeply impacted by the war in the Middle East, with lower energy supplies and rising energy costs putting economies under pressure. The headliner to kick off the summit will be U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Countries such as Japan and the Philippines, for example, will likely pay careful attention to anything he might say about Taiwan. Now, notably, this is the second year in a row that China has not sent senior officials to the Shangri-La Dialogue. That's being interpreted by some analysts as a sort of "we don't need you, we're too big shot to engage with the rest of the region" attitude. After all, Chinese leader Xi Jinping just had his bilateral with U.S. President Donald Trump in Beijing, although that meeting had a lot of pomp and ceremony but left more questions than answers. So at the Shangri-La Dialogue, countries will be meeting in groups and on the sidelines with the aim of getting more clarity for each of their specific security and economic needs. With so many things to consider, I'm glad to have DW's chief international editor, Richard Walker, and our Asia Pacific bureau chief, Georg Matthes, joining us from the summit venue in Singapore. Welcome to you both. I'll start with a question for Richard. Richard, how would you interpret China's absence at the summit for a second year in a row? As I mentioned, do you buy that analysis from some that it's some kind of Beijing power move?
Melissa, there are so many theories into why this no-show is happening. And, we've been talking to a bunch of people here. If you just take a quick look at where we are, we're like both of us, Georg and I. If you spot in the background there, actually, you can see Georg like kind of near that pillar over there. Hi, Georg.
Oh, my goodness. Hello,
Georg. We
Georg.
thought we would set up in different kind of different like angles of the lobby here. So you get a real sense of like there's the real kind of hubbub going on in this fancy hotel in Singapore, which has been a venue for this summit for the last 23 years, I think. And it's always been a tradition that the Chinese would send their defense minister pretty much always. It's been a long tradition, that's for sure. And now 2 years in a row, they have not been doing that. And a lot of speculation going on. I think this is one of the main sort of items of chatter here about why that is. And there are different theories. There's, like you suggested, there's sort of power move theory that, we don't need this anymore. And also maybe sort of thinking, well, this is a conference that's put on by a British think tank in Singapore, whereas China is really the big country in this region. Why shouldn't China be the host of the premier security event? And they do have their own forum, which they've been kind of trying to ramp up in the last few years. So that's one theory. Another theory is that the Chinese, obviously, they just had that big summit between Trump and Xi Jinping. There's talk of getting kind of military-to-military dialogue sort of back into action, like more dialogue between the two military leaders, which would be seen as a good thing, but that the Chinese don't want to go fully commit to that until they see whether Trump is going to put a hold on arms sales to Taiwan, something that the Chinese would love him to do. So that's another theory. Another theory is that all these purges have been going on in the Chinese military, that Dong Jun, the Chinese defense minister, might be hyper cautious at the moment, not necessarily wanting to put himself out there too much, worried that he might be the next target of a purge. And there's the opposite theory that actually he's being strengthened. So that's the thing with the Chinese system. You know this very well, Melissa. It is totally opaque. We're all left to speculate on the outside. And there's a lot of informed speculation going on here. But seriously, most people are just saying to me, I don't know.
Yeah, it's like reading tea leaves. Now, Georg, can you tell us a little bit about how other attendees are reacting to China's absence, particularly countries and representatives from Southeast Asia?
I think basically you have two opinions here. One is based on the fact that China clearly is, as Richard has pointed out, it is the biggest player here, not just when it comes to the economic influence, the impact, but also when it comes to defense. Everybody is looking at their new drone defense technology, at their naval progress they have made. There's underwater drones. So when it comes to the military aspects, clearly China is the elephant in the room, but absent. And so that leaves a vacuum, and that leaves some space for other topics. And there you have the other part of Southeast Asian countries who say, look, we have enough to talk about. We don't want to be drawn fully, this summit, to be fully drawn into a China-America power rivalry and all the issues that are related to it, like the issue of Taiwan. But we also have a lot of issues here. And so, for instance, you have Thailand and Cambodia still in a cold border conflict, I would say. And now Thailand has acquired drones, which could mean that the conflict, if used in this conflict, would move the fighting lines. Then you have Cambodia in there, where cybercrime and the scam centers are a big issue. That is a big concern for the entire region. You have neighboring Myanmar, that is in a civil war still, and that has not been resolved. The latest ASEAN summit, once again, couldn't provide any solution to that long-lasting civil war here. So there's a whole host of issues. Last but not least, the economic aspects, as you have pointed out, with the Strait of Hormuz being closed. So a lot to talk about, even though the Chinese are not here.
Absolutely. And even though, Georg, you've made the excellent point that the bilateral between the U.S. and China is not necessarily the only thing that is of concern of many countries. Of course, though, just to bring it back to that issue, that meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping that happened was not very long ago. And I wonder, is there a feeling then it feels like this summit, whatever happens, is an afterthought? And yet we know that U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is coming. So it seems as if the United States still wants to show that, hey, we haven't forgotten about our pivot to Asia. Question for Richard to answer.
Yeah, I mean, Pete Hegseth, he will be here. And I think there's a lot of curiosity. That's the other big kind of topic of conversation, I would say, among people here waiting for his speech early Saturday morning. That's the way it usually goes. Early Saturday morning is the U.S. Defense Secretary. Early Sunday morning, usually, the Chinese counterpart. But yeah, Hegseth obviously is the one in the limelight this time. And I think what's really interesting is to think about, okay, what kind of a speech is he going to make? Yeah. So last year, this was his debut speech at this forum. And he came, and I was just going through the transcripts and rewatching his speech earlier. And he used the term communist China 4 times in that speech. He talks of that term. It's kind of a pretty sort of, slightly aggressive kind of terminology, referring to communist China, Chinese aggression, talking openly about the risk of China, mounting an invasion of Taiwan. And while stressing that the United States, and you hear this from the US, from Trump as well, that they don't want a conflict with China, but stressing that they want to be ready for it and they want to deter it. And if necessary, they will go in for that. Okay, so that was last year. So pretty fire-breathing, communist China. This year, well, Donald Trump has just been in Beijing, and he's been schmoozing pretty intensely with Xi Jinping, coming away saying we're going to have a great relationship, talking up business deals, and starting to kind of adopt Chinese talking points about Taiwan. For instance, suggesting that the current leadership in Taiwan wants to declare independence, that it's trying to provoke a war, kind of very much taking on Chinese narratives about Taiwan, raising a lot of questions in Taiwan and in the region about whether Trump is at some point just going to ditch Taiwan and think, okay, Trump would not fight for Taiwan if China mounted some sort of attack. So that just happened a couple of weeks ago. So what is Hegseth? What version of the Trump administration are we going to get in Hegseth's speech? Are we going to get the fire-breathing communist China version? Or are we going to get something that's much more in tune with what the big man Donald Trump has been saying? So I think there's a lot of curiosity about that. So we're going to be obviously covering that on DW News. That's going to be 8:30 a.m. local time in Singapore Saturday morning. Yeah. So let's see. Nobody knows.
Well, Richard, in all of this, of course, I think it was Georg who also mentioned that there's the context of the war in the Middle East and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which is a big concern for a lot of Asian economies. And with Hegseth coming, I was curious about if both of you could talk a little bit about this American pivot to Asia. What's the feeling? It's symbolic, important that Hegseth is coming and the Chinese aren't there. But on the other hand, one wonders, there isn't a coherent U.S. foreign policy on the matter. So does it even matter if there is some attention being paid to Asia by the United States when there's no clear strategy? Why don't I start with Georg and then pick up on Richard's thoughts on that? Georg?
I think when it comes to the promises of the United States,
Yes.
I think when it comes to the Indo-Pacific strategy that was long announced by the United States, it's still, you have all of Southeast Asia basically waiting for this to happen, for some concrete actions to take place. And this is also true, I would say, at this meeting here, any presence of an American representative, in fact, any presence of Western politicians here is highly appreciated, is seen as a sign that one is serious about this part of the world, a part of the world that economically, and I think there's a real self-awareness here, is becoming more and more important as in the backyard of China, as the economies here being strong and very vibrant, and strategically becoming more and more important. We lately had this case of supposedly an underwater Chinese drone found in Indonesian waters, in a waterway that is the only safe waterway deep enough for Australian submarines to cross through into the South China Sea. So all of these aspects are becoming more and more clear, and the countries here are quite aware of that. And so they're waiting for clear action when it comes to deterrence, when it comes to more partnerships, when it comes to economic deals from the United States.
So Georg saying there that there is an interest in American engagement, sustained engagement in the region. Richard, do you believe this pivot to Asia is going to move forward, or has it really, has the United States really taken its eye off the ball once again because of things in the Middle East?
Okay, well, I'm going to refer back to the Hegseth speech from last year again, because there's a quote that I found in there, which is kind of pretty amazing when you think about it, from where we stand now. So this time, exactly a year ago, he said, "For a generation, the United States ignored this region, i.e. Asia Pacific. We became distracted by open-ended wars and regime change. The costly diversions lacked clearly defined goals and were not tied to vital and core American interests." I mean, obviously, he was referring to wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but since then, the United States has obviously got stuck in this war in Iran that it doesn't really quite know how to end. So I think, and this is having severe, as Georg has been talking about, severe knock-on effects in this region. Driving fuel shortages, driving inflation, potentially tipping many countries into recession. So I think there will be a lot of question marks about whether the United States is serious about this, the pivot to Asia, a term that, dates back to Obama, like long predates Trump. The Americans, that will say in their defense, well, look at what we do in practice, though, that they recently did this very big military exercise with the Philippines, that for all of the skepticism about Taiwan, at the end of last year, Trump did approve the largest arms deal ever with Taiwan. So, the Americans will say, well, look at our actions, not just words. But still, people look at actions in the Middle East. They look at the war with Iran that has heavily distracted the U.S. It doesn't have a solution to that yet. It has used an awful lot of weapons in that conflict. So, the questions certainly persist. And as I'm sure Georg could tell us also, it's been very interesting knock-on effects also to approval ratings of the United States versus China. And in this region, you're starting to see opinion polls. Georg, tell us more on that. But opinion polls are really moving in China's favor right now.
I'm going to get to Georg next, but I want a quick follow-up from Richard. Can you talk a little bit about the Quad? Because there was that meeting, another attempt at the Asia pivot from the United States, the Quad meeting of 4 countries, Australia, India, and Japan, and the United States. How did that go? What's your interpretation of that?
Yeah, so that's being taken. So there's Quad meetings. So that's these 4 countries, India, United States, Japan, Australia. You had Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, was in India for that. His visit to India was seen as a major sort of trying to kind of patch up exercise with the Indians, who are very disappointed in the Trump administration for getting so cozy with Pakistan over the last year. Then they had that meeting of the Quad. Rubio also clearly, attempting some sort of diplomatic overtures in the direction of these countries, which are seen as, at least the other two of them, Japan and Australia, very close U.S. allies. But what we haven't seen yet is any signal that Trump will actually go ahead with Quad summits, on the leaders level. That didn't happen last year. Will it happen this year? Open question, not for sure. I think overall, the very obvious impression that most countries in the world have at the moment is that it's not Rubio that matters in U.S. foreign policy. It's also not what Hegseth who matters, is Trump who matters, yeah? So, what is the direction that Trump is setting? And Trump's direction is certainly not really interested in multilateralism. At most, it's interested in bilateral relationships, and he's quite happy to tear those up if things, don't seem to be making him happy, as with the case of India over the last few months.
Yeah, definitely. American standing has changed a fair bit in Asia. So, Georg, I will go to you and ask you about those poll numbers about how nations across the region are now viewing China in more friendly terms, it seems. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also, I'm a little curious whether any of that is tied to the economic pain being felt throughout the region as a result of the war in the Middle East, our perception that China is a more reliable economic partner at this moment in time.
Yeah, well, I think the polls that Richard is referring to is mainly polls from Indonesia, where people have been asked, what are the role model economies they've been looking at. And so far, that was always Japan. And now it has changed towards the Chinese economic model. Now, when people were asked to what extent they are concerned about foreign influences from China or from the United States, now the concern is much more from the United States. And I think that can, in case of Indonesia, but also in most of Southeast Asia, can certainly in recent months be linked to the Strait of Hormuz. You have there a situation that is worldwide of concern, but the consequences, the economic consequences are most felt in Southeast Asia and in East Asia, not just because of the fuel prices, but also because plastic, the raw materials to make plastics, come from raw oil. And we might even see a crisis in terms of fertilizers that are coming through the Strait of Hormuz. And so if you look at the countries, if you look at Thailand, that predominantly takes its fossil fuels from Iran. They are now having a major energy crisis. They have asked for air conditions in public offices to be shut off. They've asked people to restrict their travels. They've asked public servants to stay one day in home office in order to save energy. The Philippines have called out a public energy crisis. Cambodia, Laos are struggling with the prices. And then there you have the case of Indonesia, which is at the moment on the surface, if you look at it, if you look at the gas stations, looks still fine for the public fuel because it's heavily subsidized. And here's a big problem for Indonesia. It's not only that the oil prices has gone up, so those subsidies have become more expensive, but it is also that the rupiah, the local currency, is nosediving and has lost in value against the dollar. And so it's becoming even more expensive to subsidize the fuel. And it'll be a question of how many months more the Indonesian government can keep the fuel at the same price until they have to pass down the prices to consumers. And that will certainly not go down very well.
Yeah, it's very clear that the economic issue has clearly been entwined with security issues. Georg, I'm a little curious. After we talk, both of you guys will be rushing around trying to get gossip, chasing down representatives from various countries. What are you going to try to find out about some of the goals of particular countries? I'd love to hear a little bit about your plans, and because there's plenty of people I see behind you. Georg, over to you, and then to Richard.
Well, I tell you what, normally when I come from Jakarta, I fly and I take the airplane straight into Changi Airport. Well, this time I flew to Batam, which is on the opposite side of the Singapore Strait, and crossed with a boat via the Malacca Strait, one of the key choke points, the new discovered, we can always say, geo-economic choke points, because one Indonesian representative said to me, look, I didn't know we're so powerful. If anyone would confront us, this is a big deterrence. If we would start making controls, as one minister suggested, one could even ask for money for ships passing, and then retreated that comment quickly, because any disruption to these choke points where 100,000 ships per year are passing through, it's like a highway for ships, would have major effects. So I crossed that shipping route to get a feel and want to talk to people here about it. The other topic I have is, like I mentioned, the drones that Thailand has acquired that could change that conflict with Cambodia. And another drone type is the underwater drone that has been discovered in Indonesia, potentially a Chinese underwater drone. And there's a whole idea of mapping underwater, a whole system of mapping this area underwater. Also, Indonesia has acquired lately a ship that has been worked through in Germany and given by Germany the highest technology to scan underwater for fossil fuels, for natural resources, but also to map the ground. And that has clearly strategic interests. So a lot of new topics here, no longer just border quarrels or the old power rivalry between the United States and China.
And Richard, who are you going to try to chase down? Any particular representative of a country? And I can't help but we've managed to not talk about Taiwan too much. So let's get to that. Is there even an informal Taiwanese delegation that you're going to try to connect with, Richard?
Yeah, you put the words in my mouth, Melissa. I was going to mention Taiwan. So Taiwan, as is usual with these big international conferences, Munich Security Conference is the same, don't have an official delegation, and it's often extremely striking because a lot of the current speculation about, what could be the next major crisis in international affairs is about something relating to Taiwan, where the Chinese may attempt a blockade or a quarantine or even an invasion at some point in the next few years. And the Taiwanese themselves are not at the table. They do not have a voice. But there is a small delegation that's on the unofficial level. So people are not going to be speaking at panels and they don't have government positions. But for instance, people who are previously in politics and so on. So we're going to be talking to them, certainly. And I think I'm going to be talking to a lot of other people here also about Taiwan, because the signals that came out from that recent meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, we've been talking about it a lot on DW News. Also, the signals that Donald Trump sent out in interviews after that summit, indicating, as we just mentioned earlier, he's kind of beginning to take on Chinese narratives about Taiwan. What does that mean for the Taiwanese? How are they really thinking about it? They're trying to put a brave face on it publicly at the moment, of course, trying to sort of say nothing has really changed in practice. But what is it meaning for them in terms of the kind of the psychological factor? And what does that mean for confidence among other countries in the region, particularly U.S. allies, that think, well, if the U.S. is beginning to question its commitments to Taiwan, will it also question its commitments to Japan, to the Philippines, to Australia, and other countries in the region that are really heavily dependent on the U.S.? And I think there's another level that's quite interesting, even for the countries that are not necessarily aligned completely with China or completely with the United States. A lot of countries here try to kind of stay kind of in the middle and not have to pick sides. Previously, they were worried about the U.S. and China going at it and landing in a war. And the U.S. and China typically would come here and shout at each other, and everyone else would think, oh, God, guys, can you work it out? Now, if Donald Trump is now currently trying to tip things in the opposite direction, he's talking about G2, getting friendly with Xi Jinping, maybe, starting to make deals over other countries' heads. Well, what does that mean for countries in the region? They don't necessarily want that either. So what is the kind of optimal level of conflict between the two big powers for this region? I think that's a vibe that I want to kind of get a sense for while I'm here.
And I think this is a good opportunity just to pull up a map very quickly that we have prepared, which shows the first island chain, this term that people might have heard about, which paints the security picture, because it's not just a U.S.-China issue. You can see this map. You could see that Japan is impacted, the Philippines, and a whole bunch of other countries in Southeast Asia in terms of that security chain. If China were to take over or in some way be able to impact Taiwan, it changes shipping lanes and all kinds of other issues in that region, which is why it's not just the bilateral that is important here. Now, thanks to both of you guys. I want to ask if you have final thoughts. Georg first, and then Richard.
I think one really interesting aspect in these days in a conference like this one is the definition of security. And I think it has radically changed in recent years, particularly with the discovery that geo-economic choke points can really become an issue when it comes to defense politics. Then you have the technological development, you have drones in the air, weaponized drones, underwater drones mapping. All of these issues have really redefined what security used to be about border conflicts and about how borders are run. And so that will be something that is really interesting to see. If you take again the example of Thailand and Cambodia, for instance, the border row was so far only on land. Now Thailand has cancelled a key MOU. So the question about the sea, the Gulf of Thailand, where they had an MOU with Cambodia that they agreed they will deal with natural resources in that area mutually. And now that is up in the air again. And those are the topics, I think, how the understanding of security has radically changed. And it'll be interesting to talk to delegates how they feel about it here.
Richard, your final thought.
Yeah, maybe I kind of have this feeling of it's one of those everything is connected moments. Yeah, at the moment we have the United States in this war with Iran that has created this crisis over access to energy. It's having this ripple effect almost anywhere you go. If you talk to people in Germany, what are they worried about? They're worried about inflation. Petrol is getting too expensive at the pumps. I was in Morocco recently talking to people there. What are they worried about? Everything has got too expensive. You come here to this region, as we've just been hearing from Georg, it's even another level. It's even the level that, governments are saying to their ministers, you can't travel. All of this coming from one conflict, which Donald Trump evidently hoped would be over with very soon. We had the same kind of feeling in the early stages of the Ukraine war. And the more these kind of conflicts bubble up, the more you have that interconnectedness feeling. But yeah, the more you have a real concern that the world is destabilizing to a point that is getting too much for ordinary people.
Well, there you have it. DW's Chief International Editor, Richard Walker, and Asia Pacific Bureau Chief, Georg Matthes. Thank you to you both. Go chase and doorstop your sources. And that is all for now from DW. We'll be covering the Shangri-La Dialogue throughout this weekend. Keep an eye on our social media platforms on YouTube and elsewhere. I'm Melissa Chan. Thanks for joining us, and until next time.